Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be back doing another in our series of interviews for our forthcoming book. And so excited to finally be interviewing you, Luke. We've been trying to set this up for ages, not least because you're noted by the Property Chronicle as one of the best minds in real estate investing. So the fact that we haven't interviewed you yet is a crime. So it is such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for bearing with us. Can you let's start by hearing a little bit about you for anyone that doesn't know you, your background, your work, your particular areas of interest.
Yeah, sure. Well, for starters, I mean, thank you, Amy and James, for having me. I know a lot has been happening over recent months, so yeah, great to be joining you. So yeah, I guess you could say that I have a bit of a romantic sort of background with the built environment. In Australia, it's, as some people may be able to tell from my accent, is where I'm from. It's very much viewed similar to how it is in the US as a vehicle for social mobility, right? And that's the lens through which I originally was looking at it, even as a teenager. So when I was in the Australian Defence Force, I started, researching and studying the housing market and, how I could use it to my advantage and things like that. And found I had a little bit of a knack for it, so this was around about 16 years ago. And then so started formally pursuing it, the discipline whenever I could. I would, it's probably a bit of a toxic thing to do, so I wouldn't recommend doing this, but in my early 20s, I'd wake up at about 2 a.m. before work and do my study before I would then go and train sailors in Sydney at one of the Navy bases there. And yeah, that was an interesting few years. But yeah, then I entered.
Exhausting few years as well.
It was, and it led to a few things. Certainly burnout. The word burnout is used a lot these days for people who are stressed out. But I tell you what, like a legit actual burnout, experiencing something like that when you're like, what was I, 23, I think 24 or something, is, fun, but still got a lot of things done. But yeah, then found that knack for the research on the side of the sector that I really vibed with. Was always a big fan of the interdisciplinary side, and so kind of never left university, as well as trying to earn an income at the same time. And about 5 or so years ago now, that I ended up in the world of Oxford, which brought me over to the UK, and haven't been able to shake the UK since. So I've been here since, and naturally now head of research at Pi Labs and an associate fellow at the University of Oxford Said Business School, where I focus on innovation in the built environment. So I guess that's kind of like the high level sort of journey of where I came from and yeah, what I'm up to now.
Amazing, thanks. I'm glad you've got past that burnout phase. 2 a.m. research will do that for you.
Yeah, just to clarify 1 minute, because I was a bit shocked, and I won't go into the detail as to why I was up at 4:16 this morning. You messaged me at 4:16 this morning with the link to your paper, and I'm sitting there going, what the hell? I was up, God knows what reason. I saw you, and then thought, well, do you know what? Because I'm up at this time, I'm going to like your post that was me at 4:16, just so that you knew I was up as well. So the early morning is still there, I'm afraid.
You two need some sleep.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, I go to bed early, so that might be a distinction against James. So I go to bed at about 8:30 now. So at least it's. I'm trying to align with the baby. The baby goes to bed at about 6, so I don't want to hold on too much further behind that. So I'll go to bed at 8:30. Yeah, get up around 4. But 2 a.m. is a tough. It is a tough. Like 2 a.m. is an ungodly hour.
The three of us need a little offline chat. You two and a psychologist after this call. Okay, everyone, this is what not to do at 2 or 4 o'clock in the morning. But some wonderful. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to come in and just reference the fact that obviously we've had a bit of a break, right? You and I, in terms of leadership. So I think we'll be picking it up a little bit again. And by the way, you may not have seen that I changed the title, but it was 50 Leaders in 50 Days. I've actually 50 leaders in 500 days. Keep on flowing. But the whole point of this is obviously with the book that Amy and I are writing, it's all about how do we share the learnings, because obviously not everything that Luke says will be brought into the book, but with a mind like his, we want to make sure that we share all the sort of thoughts and feelings that he has about the industry and where it's going. And obviously, well, I would hope it's an interesting discussion for all of you to listen into. So that's part of the reason why we're doing it. But just referencing that 4:16 a.m. post that you put me and Brendan Wallace of Fifth Wall this morning. Do you mind if we start there, Amy, in terms of
No, let's do it.
Because that was particularly interesting to me, and I'll just sort of frame it that Brendan had put a post out questioning, sort of the retrofit model and the fact, there's often, and I've been in so many conferences where they're looking at the ESG and the sustainability argument and the built environment being such a significant contributor to all of this. And the quote that goes around all the time is that 80% of all the buildings that will exist in 2050 are already in existence. And I questioned and clarified that, as did Brendan, and you were like, no, I've done some deeper research and I found out that it's actually not. I'm not entirely convinced that's true. So can we just start there, just because it might frame the challenge the built environment has around sustainability?
Yeah.
What has
sure.
research shown about existing stock, and what does that mean about the retrofit challenge the industry has?
Yeah, so for a bit of context, so I mean, you framed it really well, James, and so that stat has been floating around a lot. The 80% of 2050 stock has already been built and has already been. What does that mean? Is that like as of 2020? Is that of 2025? Is it of right now? When did this stat actually come out? All those sorts of things, I didn't necessarily pick that up as comfortably. And so I thought what I would do, the market anywhere on this planet, with the exceptions of, say, ancient Rome, areas of the Middle East, the cradle of civilization, some parts of East Africa, if you want to go even further back, where urban development has been a thing for thousands of years. Okay, if we kind of like sort of acknowledge that was some time ago and look at the more recent sort of timeline of urban development from the industrial revolutions, you've got the UK as kind of the home, UK is the origin of the first industrial revolution, right? And so you've got the longest tail of what we, by today's standards, consider to be real estate. But then when I thought not just about the UK, but globally, and look at the development pipeline, population trends, things like that, it just didn't feel right that it was 80%. So I thought, well, if I just use the UK as the most likely to be aligned with that number, which in defense of some proponents of that statistic is what they meant. They meant the UK's stock, not the world's stock.
Okay. That is never made clear.
Yes, oftentimes it's not. But some proponents do specify that they're referring to the UK. Others are referring to global. So in the UK, my estimate, based on trends, based on past patterns of the amount of demolition and new build that takes place in housing, which is the vast majority of building stock in any market, right? So it's a good sort of means of sort of extrapolating across commercial as well. In the UK, I estimate that as of next year, 72% will be built by 2050. Now, not crazy different to 80, right? But then if you also factor in developing economies where most of the world's construction and population growth is going to take place over the coming few decades, or even for the rest of this century, that number really starts diminishing, right? So 57% of today's building stock, like the gross floor area across the globe today, increase that by 57%. That's the expectation by 2050 from the UN. That's how they're projecting what the carbon footprint of buildings will be by 2050, right? So that's massively different. That is essentially, if I turn that into the same statistic, that would be somewhere around the 50s or 60s, right?
So sorry, just take me back a step there, just so I understand.
Yeah.
That so just go back to what you were talking about, the UN and the floor space predicted in terms of just define.
Yeah. Sorry, say that last bit again. Define.
So just explain that again for me, just so I can really understand.
Yes. So the current gross floor area of all real estate right now, or as of 2025, I do my projections as of next year just because it's cleaner, right? As of 2025, the gross floor area is expected by 2050 to increase by 57%.
Okay.
Right. Now, if we assume that 80% statistic, then that's like something more like, I don't know, like in the 30s or 20s, something like that, off the top of my head, right? So that is a big gap. So if we're like going to emerging markets, if we're going to some places, obviously the ambitious giga projects in the Middle East, looking at the massive initiatives around urban development in Africa, in South America, in many parts of Asia, what we've seen in China over recent decades, and even though there's been this Evergrande situation in China, what's still projected to be taking place there, at least in the immediate future. We have a bit of a different story. So why is this relevant? It's not like a gotcha sort of situation for anyone espousing the 80% statistic. But what I'm trying to emphasize around that is let's acknowledge that retrofit is a very important part of the environmental transformation of the built environment. But let's not lose sight of the fact that there are new builds in the pipeline and that will be coming in decades that are still being built in really antiquated ways, right? And are going to be embodying all of that carbon for the rest of our lives, for the rest of our children's lives, and so on. So it's just making sure we've got our eyes on both spaces.
Luke, what do you see as the most important sustainability innovations that are happening at the moment? I know you mentioned in your paper hydrogen and a couple of other things. What sort of excites you? What's happening in this space that you think is going to make a real impact?
One thing, Amy, that I find to be fun, this is always a little bit of a historical anecdote, but one of my fun sort of pet intrigues with the built environment is if you look at, like, I use the example of concrete, right? So a concrete slab. So we pour concrete slabs to build homes, to build office blocks, whatever, and we do that just as generally speaking, as just a non-diverging slab of concrete, right? It is what it is. It's a rectangular, or however shaped the floor plate is of the building, slab of concrete. And we've actually known for a really long time, right? For a really long time that we don't need to use that many materials. Actually, we only need a fraction of those materials for the same amount of strength, right? And when you go into, again, old buildings, back in the day when we didn't have the resources to just throw materials into builds like that, right? That this is like in some ways, you might say, a negative byproduct of our affluence, right? Is the ability to waste materials like this. And we see this with food, we see it with construction materials, we see it everywhere, like consumerism, right? This is the whole consumerism thing. So this goes into the very fabric of our buildings, this material waste. And the challenge has been that it's been very uneconomical for every single building to get the right smarts into that building to be able to design the most materially efficient way of building that same space, right? Lots of intelligence needs to go into that customization, right? And so it's way more straightforward just to pour tons and tons of concrete into a new housing development or a new commercial precinct, right? And be done with it. The problem is we're really familiar now with the fact that the carbon footprint of concrete is off the charts. It's around 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Off the top of my head, it's not exactly 10, but around there. And so what is the role of AI in this? How can AI automate that human smarts to make the uneconomical task of putting engineers and physicists into every single design of a slab and other parts of the building materials into the design process of a building to be able to markedly reduce those material inputs? I think that's a really interesting one. Pretty long-winded, sorry. But I think that's one of the many interesting sort of spaces.
And is that something that's happening already? You're seeing that happening, or is this a future innovation?
I'm seeing, I'd give a shout out to, obviously I've got a bit of Oxford bias, have pretty heavily immersed into that ecosystem, but there are some students at Oxford right now trying to commercialize some of the great work being done at ETH Zurich around that. And I think, they're a really good example of turning sort of concepts into action. I'm going to something we were talking actually before we went live about, Amy. And on the, say, automation process, what we've observed at Pi Labs, especially since this ChatGPT boom, has been an increased level of acceptance and sophistication around the role that AI could play in the built environment within the C-suite and like more broadly in real estate groups. And so how that's flowed onto the startup world, we've observed is that now startups are going, okay, there's enough, that there are open and willing customers here for us to be able to develop this product and actually be able to sell it to people. And so the sorts of products coming up now are really interesting, I think. Like, you know, you say maybe not the ChatGPT of real estate, but, you know, if you're familiar with Midjourney, which is essentially like what they refer to as multimodal generative AI, essentially text prompts to generate images. How can higher fidelity versions of that be used for use cases like the one that, you know, I'm mentioning?
James.
Sorry, I'm really conscious. My office door is open today, which is wonderful.
Right.
You get the fresh sort of, you know, fresh air and the light coming through, but it also means I get all these people walking by, sort of looking in, talking, and then couriers decide to just knock on my office. So I'm muted.
Well, I've got a dog and a screaming baby, so you know it's a similar sort of situation. Well, I
win.
might have the same problem. I might have the same problem.
It's a working thesis, really, that when we're looking at digital transformation, Amy and I sort of come up with the fact that there are so many frameworks out there. When we're looking at innovation in the built environment, we sort of tailored a couple of thoughts around what we're calling sort of practical processes and people processes in the built environment, where, you know, I don't know, practical are things like, you know, strategy, data, technology, whereas people are things like leadership, culture, vision, so on, and we're sort of breaking them up. But really, in and of themselves, you can have all of those put together. It still doesn't make digital transformation journey happen. There are three at the moment, and I'm interested in your views perhaps on this. We're sort of working on a basis of three, what we're calling the drivers of digital transformation, where what you've just talked about with that, you know, sort of this AI revolution, I genuinely mean the fact that it's only been around a short time in terms of the mass acceptance that it's possible. And that speaks to a productivity driver, that the real estate industry is finally accepting they need to be more productive with less, let's say. The second is obviously sustainability, which we've touched on a little bit here. And the final is affordability. So affordability is relative. It doesn't matter if you're in Nigeria or if you're in London. You know, there is an affordability crisis that the real estate sector has. And again, I don't think it really matters whether we're talking residential, commercial, industrial, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I'm interested in your thoughts there, really, which is there are three drivers: affordability, productivity, and sustainability. Do you feel that is accurate? Is there anything that we've missed which is driving the change? It's not the actual change. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, you know, I have a mental model that I work with that's conveniently three-pronged as well, particularly on the more academic side of my work, for the sort of mega trends type framing, right? But if I look at, I think affordability is a really interesting one. So affordability kind of comes down to the, you know, the bare nuts and bolts of, you know, my, you know, very early real estate career and, you know, what's certainly very much intrigued me. I think actually, James, the last time you and I spoke in this setting was when Pi Labs published a piece of the action, which was our fractionalization paper. And what actually sparked my interest in that topic quite a few years back was this issue around affordability and whether it makes things worse and all those sorts of things. So I think there are a few interesting things here. Sustainability, a cynic, and these still exist. I see this on LinkedIn almost on a daily basis. A cynic may refer to sustainability as a passing trend. I tend to disagree. I think sustainability just has different labels, but it always is sustainability. So we had like CSR, right? Back in the day, corporate social responsibility, ESG peaked sort of last year, and we're sort of seeing the back end of the ESG acronym being used. But sustainability at its core will, I think, persist through all of that and become even more significant. I mean, I tagged a few academic colleagues actually only around 4 o'clock this morning, James, in a post that a whole bunch of academics have come together and sort of doubled down now on the regulatory side of sustainability. Productivity, I agree with you on. I think that comes down to the economical side of what I was talking about with generative AI, and I think more broadly AI and more broadly technology as well. Because when you really look at AI and the way that people have been framing it right now, some people are talking about technologies that have been around for quite a long time. Some people are talking about deep tech. This varies a lot. But if we just look at the role technology plays, the way that I would frame your lens around productivity is what I said earlier around the uneconomical tasks becoming economical. And so probably my favorite go-to example of this, which is in our latest paper, in PyLab's latest paper, Sustainably Intelligent, which was on AI and environmental sustainability. One of our portfolio companies who's been in our ecosystem for quite a long time, they're called Contilio, and they're a construction tech startup. And essentially they deploy LiDAR backed by AI, right? Analytics. You can essentially, like if you're wearing it on a hard hat or something like that, as a foreman's walking through the construction site, to essentially identify where installations are taking place, compare that to the plans, and identify where defects have happened, right? And the reason that that's interesting is because rework can be up to, there's a massive range here, but can be up to 30% of the cost of a construction project. Materials, now we're not just talking economic costs, we're talking environmental costs, right? Especially when, again, we're talking about concrete. And so the problem up until using something like LiDAR was that humans had to manually inspect that. And it was uneconomical to do that across the whole project because why? Because it just costs too much, right? The resources to be able to bring in people and check the plans against every single thing that was being installed was uneconomical for almost everything, right? You had to rely on the keenness of the human eye and, say getting coverage of around 10% of the project. So a lot of stuff was missed until the window fitters came at the end, put it in and went, oh, this column's in the wrong spot. You have to knock all this down and rebuild it over here, right? I think that's a really good metaphor across your 3-pillar paradigm here. It affects affordability because it affects the cost of construction, right? Massive economic point there, right? And flow-on effects to the owners of the assets, the occupiers of the assets, the net operating, not an NOI, but certainly the NPV, right? So you're talking real estate economics here. That very much affects that pillar. Productivity, foundational to that business model. And of course, there's a sustainability angle there around wasted materials.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of breaking that all down, actually. And that's quite useful. I hadn't really looked at it from that side. So that's great, Luke. And I think, to be honest, if Amy and I were talking about this, we've been very much focused much more on the whole angle around productivity and sustainability. I think that's been a major focus. The affordability bit is something I probably need to look at in a little bit more detail. But for me, there is, and again, a lot of what I look at is what's happening today and what's going to be happening in 20 years, 50 years, which is where I think the real estate industry is at its weakest, actually. I think we're looking here all the time.
Agree.
And that affordability question for me really brings out philosophical points about what does it mean to own a home. For generations, we've understood what home ownership means, as in our home is our castle, the bank has owned the majority of the home and you pay it off over time. And I think that's evolving over time. And essentially that generation rent that we now have, a lot of them are never really thinking that home ownership is possible. And as a consequence, there's a philosophical debate here around what does home ownership really mean for 3 or 4 generations hence. That's one real big element of affordability for me. That is the same wherever you are. But that also brings up questions that we've started to see a little bit in the commercial world around affordability of, and I suppose it's affordability to an extent, of leases and lease length, and how different businesses are adapting around what a commercial building now means. And lease length and flexible working, home working, and all that is now coming into it all, which then goes into another philosophical question that I think we have to start thinking about, and I'm interested in anybody's opinions on this, around we've been for so many years defined by residential, commercial, industrial, retail, and actually I think that has a philosophical element to it as well, which is why are we so defined by that? We're starting to see this massive shift of commercial buildings into residential in, say, New York. There is a massive move for that. I put it to anybody that that's going to happen in almost every single major city. Maybe not so much in the sort of secondary and tertiaries, but major cities where there's so much stock, which might then have that influence around what we started this conversation around about in terms of how much stock do we need to facilitate sites. So bringing it round full circle, which is probably almost a debate which is far too far off in my head to even start thinking about it. That was another delivery man, by the way, who stood out.
How much are you getting delivered, James?
Do you know what he was doing at 4 o'clock this morning? Ordering things on Amazon.
Yeah.
Amy will know this. So my wife literally works next door in a wedding caterers, and so there's obviously some wedding that is going on in the next couple of days. So it's like food. But just coming back, I just want to come back to, I suppose.
Well, for any retail landlords watching, James is your obvious nemesis here, right? He doesn't buy anything on the high street.
I don't know who needs to hear this, but you do not need anything from Amazon today. It's just too easy, isn't it?
Yeah. But sorry to break your flow. Go ahead, James.
No, I was just, because all of those things are just, I suppose, elements that I'm mulling over in my brain. But
can I pick up on this affordability point, but from a different angle? So I'm really interested in the concept of frugal innovation, and the built environment has forever had actually huge resources behind it. And we know that sometimes that can create a problem because we do it because we can. We don't always question whether we should. And with this focus on sustainability, there is a much greater need now to start innovating a bit more frugally. We see lots of other countries doing it. We know that, when resources are limited, actually sometimes the greatest innovations are created. Are you seeing that at all in the built environment, Luke? Are people thinking a bit more frugally now? And would you say that is having any kind of impact on the innovations that they're able to create and the work that they're able to do?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because there's this, I hate to be too cliche about it, right? But one of the first business books that one would read, going into their business lives or careers might be 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? From Stephen Covey, right? But for anyone who hasn't read it, essentially from memory, this has been a while, but the final habit is sharpen the saw. Right, which is like, essentially the metaphor that's like, if you come to cut down a tree, not very on topic for us, a bit off brand for our conversation, but if you're going to go to a tree and cut it down with a saw, and you do it, and you're too busy to sharpen it, you do it with a blunt blade, it's going to take you a long time. If you go away, if you go away for an amount of time and sharpen that saw, and it feels like you're wasting time because you're not chopping down that tree, and that's the job, right? That's the task that you're faced with. You feel like you're wasting time, you're wasting resources, rather than going and getting it done. But once you sharpen saw, obviously the job itself becomes way more effective. And I think that metaphor is really relevant to, Amy, what you're talking about around, say, the innovation dilemmas facing the built environment. So I have a relationship with UK's DLUC. And so for people outside of the UK, that's essentially the planning and housing government department. And they have something called their PropTech steering board, which I help with. And when we were having some early conversations around this, maybe a year or two ago, I was talking with a fellow traveler in that world about the home buying process in the UK as one example, right? So anyone who's been in a chain will know the hell that is, right? And the thing that fascinates me is, as a foreigner, as a distant cousin from the damned colonial frontier, right? Riding kangaroos to school and all those sorts of things, right? Wrangling cattle, none of which I did. I was born and raised in suburbia, but what I would come with a message to my British cousins would be that's not the case elsewhere in the vast, expansive Commonwealth that deploys English common law, right, and the Westminster system, right. So the UK, built these political entities and these structural entities that most of us now use around the world. But the problem is there's this first mover at disadvantage, right? So this is a more specific UK problem, but there are broader challenges, I think, in other markets as well. It's not just the UK that faces this issue. But the one that I point to that speaks to some of the themes that you guys are looking at with this book and some of the things that we're talking about, Amy, to your question as well, is that home buying process. We can quantify every month wasted in home buying, where a home is essentially sitting in this state of purgatory, right? Where it's not being effectively used by its previous owner or its new owner. It's kind of just sitting there waiting for something new to happen. It's being underutilized. Every month of waste is tens of thousands of homes not being put to use just in the private rented sector. That doesn't quantify owner occupation. So when we talk about the undersupply of homes, the effect that has on housing affordability, all these sorts of things, the fact that there is not yet technological innovation that solves that problem of waste in the home buying process in the UK is tens of thousands, maybe even up to towards 100,000 homes at any one time not being put to use. It's almost like the unemployment rate. There is perpetually this many people unemployed, right? And the longer they're unemployed, the more there are that are unemployed. It's the same sort of logic with buying and selling homes. Something, just one issue. Now, if we look across the whole sector with lack of innovation, that applies to everything. That applies to construction timeframes, going back to the Contilio example and rework, right? Rework pushes back timelines by quite a lot. And it applies the whole way across the value chain, from planning the whole way through to demolition.
Okay. So sorry, James, carry on.
I was just going to say, there's a perfect segue into, I suppose, one of the core questions that Amy and I ask. And I'm very conscious of not making this UK-centric. I think.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
And by the way, what you're saying about the home buying in the UK is absolutely bang on. But there are other systems that we see which are far more effective, which are generally newer real estate markets, which are out there, which I certainly think. But actually, that's bollocks, because even in Scotland's home buying process is an awful lot more streamlined than we are. It's just the UK side of things. But looking globally, when you're talking about the innovation in the sector, and obviously that's where a lot of your writings have come from. Obviously, your work with Pi Labs, you're always generally looking at sort of the industry and going through a period of change. One of our core questions is always around the real estate industry embracing change. What's your view on the real estate sector as it is today in its attitude to innovation and embracing change? Because I think they're probably two slightly different things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think there's kind of like the mainstream sort of throwaway one-liner around real estate doesn't adopt technology and isn't embracing of change.
Yep.
Which the three of us and anyone else has heard, right? Certainly plenty of times. But there, I think there's some interesting nuance in it, right? And I think there is some responsibility, not wanting to point the finger too heavily at you now, James, as on the entrepreneurial side, not you individually. James Dursley is the problem. James Dursley is the problem. I think it's multifaceted, as you alluded to. I think number one is that it's important to note that a lot of innovations historically have taken place in the built environment, right? So there is precedent in the built environment to be innovative. But if I'm to steal something that Andrew Baum, a mutual say colleague, industry champion, who I think, James, you've got quite a bit of a history with, I've collaborated with for quite a long time now as well. One point that he makes quite eloquently is that real estate is a store of wealth, right? And you see this behaviorally when people make money in certain industries. The way that they conserve it is by throwing it into real estate, right? And that's, more stable. And there are benefits to real estate being stable and less volatile, and illiquid and all these sorts of financial concepts in the real estate sector. But the negative outcome of that is almost like this if it ain't broke, don't fix it attitude, right? If you can sit on an asset for 20 years and leverage it and make a massive return on equity, that in some ways will reflect, the returns that one would expect from venture capital or something like that, right? My return on equity for my first housing investment was greater than most VC funds return, right? Because I leveraged it. If there's that sort of safe as houses mantra, then why would you retrofit it with technology to make it more occupier friendly, or to make it more sustainable, or to do whatever you want to do with it? There's no burning platform, as they put it, right? But I think that that's changing, because one point that you made a little bit earlier was around like these distinct property types, right? We used to have retail, we used to have industrial, we used to have housing, and all these sorts of things. But now those lines are starting to blur a little bit. Talking about retrofit in New York, right? And what's the most effective way to do that? Now that burning platform has emerged, I personally think that attitude is changing. And so now you've kind of got innovators in the real estate sector into two groups. And I think that this is great. I think, again, that some skeptics may not like this framing, but I think that this is how the world works. This is how the earth turns. The two groups, I think, right now of innovators in the built environment are people who use it as a sort of a branding opportunity. This is what we do, and look how this differentiates us as a real estate brand, right? And then people who are actually trying to solve significant pain points in their portfolios because of the burning platform. Our commercial assets are underperforming, or whatever the issue happens to be. And that comes back to the point around hype. And I think that hype has some negative outcomes, people exploiting it, misusing catchphrases, things like that. But hype also prompts action. And, Amy, I know that this is in your world, right? Around behavior, right? Organizational behavior, consumer behavior, things like this. Consumer behavior is prompted by things like hype and around the image. And I think the sector should try and make good use of that where they can, where it's productive, not obviously where it's destructive.
Can I ask a question from your perspective? So we've talked about this, the built environment being generally not readily embracing of change, but there are obviously people that are doing some really exciting things in the built environment. Who are they? And I don't mean that in terms of specific names. I mean, mention names by all means, but what types of people are breaking the mold in this space? What's driving them to break the mold? Why are they doing it? What's their motivation? What's it going to take for more people to step into that kind of zone of being ready to embrace a bit of uncertainty and innovate a bit more?
Yeah, it's a good question, and a familiar framework around this is Rogers' innovation adoption curve, right? Where you have the infamous innovators and early adopters, and then sort of the laggards at the back end.
Yeah,
and that's used in a lot of disciplines. It's used in innovation, in marketing, in all sorts of academic disciplines, right? But I think like at the front end, those innovators generally who are like really actually boots on the ground, maybe even developing their own technologies and things like that. So one thing that I've found fascinating in my travels is the real estate groups, whether asset owners or service organizations, whatever sort of bag that they work on, right, are developing in-house. And I think that's fascinating. I think, I was only a couple of weeks ago in the Square Mile of London, meeting with a well-known sort of household name type of real estate group, and they were taking me through one of their platforms. And I was really impressed by what was able to have been achieved in their organization, despite the sort of innovator's dilemma thing that we hear all the time around, not wanting to cannibalize your own business, right? And things like that. So I think that's cool. You're seeing frontier tech development. And I think for the entrepreneurs, that's something to be mindful of, is that real estate groups are, at least the larger ones that have the resources, are becoming more sophisticated where they can develop their own products. And why? What is the why here? For the service providers, I think it's a lot more around differentiating themselves against the other consultants or whatever, right? Or we can, include this tech product in our relationship with you, XYZ. There are still, say, what you might call late adopters. Do you want me to name them, by the way? Do you want names?
If you want to, yeah, great.
Yeah, so some cool innovations that I've seen recently, like even some SMEs, obviously relatively fresh from MIPIM, right? MIPIM was only a few weeks ago. Saw some really cool things from the likes of Avison Young, even from over in Germany from a smaller scale firm called Kintyre. Some interesting stuff that they'd been developing. I know that there are some burgeoning innovation groups within firms. JLL is obviously quite broadly known for their both in-house and externally sourced innovation strategies, right? There are some pretty solid names there. GPE in the sort of London ecosystem was known for some, really, how would I frame this? Open-minded, let's try it out sort of attitude to some of these technologies. Let's put some budget aside and give this a go. We can see that there's some value add from this, and working with quite a few of the startups at Pi Labs that we were working with. And we saw some really positive things play out there with quite a few of our startups. And even if you look at Grosvenor is a name in the UK for 1,000 years, right? And they own some pretty well-known sort of heritage assets, Mayfair and Belgravia and the like. And they've got really good use cases now or case studies with the likes of Demand Logic, who has been in the prop tech ecosystem since 2007. So some really good examples of pretty big real estate names actually going full throttle. I mean, JLL, I'm not sure how this is progressing for them, but I remember a few years back, I think it was that far ago, a conversation being had around them actually being a technology company and not a real estate company or something like that. I think there's maybe been a little bit of a step back around that. I'm not sure exactly how that's played out in this economy that the world has been navigating, but yeah, there's definitely a lot more activity, legitimate, genuine, tangible activity versus like people meeting and talking about stuff and not actually doing much.
I am going to pick up on a couple of points in there.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a comment and then I'm going to ask you a question because I really like the cannibalization element of the innovator's dilemma. I think it's a really interesting point. JLL, for me, is a fascinating case study. In the sense that, and Christian Ulrich is in Cretech coming up in May, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting him and actually having a chat with him, because I have a theory that when he joined in 2016 or 17, I think it was, set out a classic transformation journey, classic, absolute playbook. Probably got some consultants in to basically say this is how you transform your business. And did it. That's where obviously JLLT and Spark and everything was the originator from and built out. But I've started to see, and I could be wrong, and I'm very happy to be challenged, that we're sort of what, 8 years into that now. And the sort of the challenge I put to him is the fact that they haven't deviated from that strategy, and that the setting up of Spark hasn't necessarily worked in terms of the global aspect of it all. I've spoken to various people around the world who said Spark was largely irrelevant for us. We've had to go and do it ourselves. We've gone and done it, but they wanted it all going through Spark. I've had JLLT obviously have had their challenges just recently, and I almost feel that what the leadership team did was fantastic. And a perfect case study for Amy and I to write about and say, if you want to do something, and this is a classic, innovator's dilemma of understanding the sort of sustained and radical innovation. And if you were going to investigate radical innovation, you set out an entirely separate entity, which is what they did, which is, the upper tier of management is linked, but everything else is separate balance sheet, separate everything. But they haven't then reviewed it in the changing, interest rate hike problem, the COVID situation, when really what transformation journeys are all about is being dynamic and radical and constantly changing and evolving. And they haven't done that. And that's the only limitation, I think, on the JLL side, which I really want to be challenged on, because I don't have the visibility or the detail on that upper echelon of management. And I'm interested to try and grab Christian for a cup of tea or coffee, whatever, when he's over, and just say, talk to me about the journey you've been on, because you know it, but nobody else does. And I think you've been very public about what you've done, but where are you now?
What are the nuts and bolts? Yeah, that's a really It's a really good point. And you're probably a bit closer to the elephant than I am, but I guess there are a few things I'd point to here. Number one is that whole A to Z is, I think, missed a lot on the innovation side of the built environment. So I've authored now 2 volumes on technology deployment wipers at Pi Labs, right? The first one was, I think, published in 21 or 22, and the second one was published last year. And what I quite deliberately did with those is I told the whole story. And the reason I did is exactly to your point, is that a lot of the case studies coming out about innovation in the built environment is these people came together and these results were produced. This is fantastic. You should try and replicate it within your organizations, right? And the thing that's missed in that is that most of these journeys are really up and down, as is the entrepreneurial journey, right? And at many moments in that journey, they have faced the real likelihood of the project being discontinued or in some other way marked as a failure, right? But this is how they navigated it. So this challenge was presented and they overcame it in this way. And this challenge was presented and they overcame it in this way. Not that these people met and this was done, because then that sets unrealistic expectations in the sector that, prop tech is out there and you just deploy prop tech or you deploy an innovation strategy and Bob's your uncle, all of a sudden you're the most successful real estate firm in the world, right? I think, to your point, I think that there's too much of that. I think there's too much of, these people are just successful with tech. Look at them talking on panels at prop tech events or whatever. Another element to that, I think, is it goes back to actually how I would frame my own career journey, which is that when I was leaving the Defence Force and going professional in the real estate sector, I faced a crossroads of going into the large firms, right? Or going into sort of more nimble SME type environments. And I've only ever worked in the SME space since I left the Defence Force. And the reason I did was because part of my academic journey has been aligned with Amy's world in that sort of organizational behavior and change sort of stuff, right? So one of my programs was psychology, another one was in innovation and change management. And one thing I learned there was this notion of the steering the battleship thing. And it comes back to the innovator's dilemma, James, that it's really, really hard to facilitate change across a multinational organization with so many working parts to it. What is that magical secret sauce? And so, I imagine there would be some really interesting things to dissect around what departments within a large MNC, real estate MNC, were really comfortable with change, which ones were heavily resistant. I have my theories, right? I bet you sales-oriented groups, as an example, would be very resistant to the deployment of technology and change within the organization, whereas maybe other parts of these large MNCs are more conducive to change. Hypothesis, I don't know.
Yeah, certainly something interesting to investigate. I'll let you know if there's any questions that you can think up about. If I can sit and have a chat with Christian at JLL, let me know. I'm definitely keen to grab him for a coffee at some point and investigate it.
And his competitors. See what if their competitors have the same, like, X departments are slower to adopt or adapt to change than others, and why do you think that is? Is there, people talk a lot about cognitive diversity, right? As well as the more familiar diversity metrics like demographic diversity. I wonder, like, I've seen that play out in organizations. Like, groupthink is a legit thing. It's not just a trendy thing to talk about on diversity panels, right? Groupthink is a massive problem when there's not enough diversity in the room. How does that obstruct genuine change? Like, in real tangible ways.
Something on your people side, Amy. There you go. We can pick up. It sounds like a 1984 philosophy, but probably.
Luke, I think we're getting towards the end, and I like to end on a positive.
Oh, well, hang on. Can I?
Have you got
Can I talk about eating, cannibalization, just quickly before
Go
we...
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Go
Sorry,
on,
I've skipped a
then.
few of the questions. Sorry.
Get nice, Amy. Let's talk about cannibalization first, shall we?
Sounds great.
Go to the
Fascinating.
other end of the spectrum. But just because, and I just explain why, Luke. I gave a speech last week to a PLC, and I used a bit of Hemingway from his 1926 novel, As the Sun Rises, I think it's called, where one character asked the other, how did you go bankrupt? And he said, it went gradually and then quickly. Gradually, then suddenly, sorry, just to clarify. Which is very indicative of, really how disruption genuinely happens. And I always like it as a nice quote to bring in. But I saw the face of this room suddenly go, oh, and I saw the leaders of the room and go, what the hell is this guy talking about? My opposite to Amy, who likes to finish on a positive. I was like, oh,
no, you're insolvent.
Yeah. My point to get across was, and I always do it in a nice way, but it was, this is the story of how over the long term, businesses, if they're not evolving and looking and understanding incremental and radical innovations, can come unstuck very, very gradually. And you think everything's wonderful, and it's said the best time to really genuinely innovate is when the business is right at the top.
Yeah.
But the key point is, and this is what I was saying to the sort of senior leaders, which is about the thesis of cannibalization. You've got to go in and challenge your entire business model and be willing to potentially set something up external, potentially set something up which is very radically different to your core business. But as in the classic innovator's dilemma, where you look at the sort of the lower margin customers, which are really forgotten about at the moment, they're not important to your general day-to-day business, and question it. And it's about cannibalization, cannibalizing your existing business model. Is that possible in real estate, given the slow and steady approach? It's a physical, tangible thing. Can we cannibalize assets in the way? Is that just going back to what we talked about earlier, the realization that we've been so structured for so long around residential, commercial, and so on? And actually, the cannibalization is getting rid of all classifications. Is the cannibalization around understanding how real estate investment works, which is obviously, as you say, Andy Bourne's massive thesis of understanding about where innovation starts from and ends. What's your feeling on cannibalization?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I have a lower brow version of the Hemingway quote, which is, I used to have it on my monitor when I was an analyst, which was, I work hard, I get up early and stay late year after year, obviously butchering it like hell, but it took me 17 years, 9 months and 3 days to become an overnight success. That was Lionel Messi, right? So in other words, all of this stuff is always just operating underneath the radar. Then boom, all of a sudden, oh, this thing has happened and it came from nowhere. And so it's never the case. Right. And that's just like ChatGPT and generative AI, right? This hype cycle, the metaverse thing, right? All of this, like augmented reality and virtual reality has been going for decades. Artificial intelligence, the phrase was coined in the 1950s, right? It's just generative AI that's, kind of become more of a thing lately. But to the cannibalization point, can you cannibalize assets? I think what we've grown accustomed to, and this is why I love history. I always come back to history because another one of my favorite quotes, it appears in the Bible and in many other parts around the world, where like there's no, like history repeats itself, right? Like there's nothing new under the sun, however you want to put it. And what we've grown accustomed to post-war especially, right, is this idea of perpetual growth. And this is one of the central theses of my work, is that living memory is perpetual growth. And even though we've had economic downturns, we had the global financial crisis early in my career, we've got what we're going through now. Most people in their 20s and 30s especially haven't really experienced legitimate difficulty. They might have been in uni when the global financial crisis happened or something like that, right? And so, like a little blip happens and all of a sudden they're like chickens with their heads cut off, right? I was like, well, wait a minute, you should have seen what happened in this period of time. But if we zoom out even further and go beyond living memory, we have decline, right? So if you want to get a bit fun and quirky with this, what happened during the Great Fire of London? What happened? The bubonic plague, right? Again, sorry to keep using UK metaphors, but they're some of my favorite. This applied across Europe and many parts of the world. When the Black Death came to Europe, populations plummeted, right? And all of a sudden you had a massive shift in dynamic around industrial relations, because all of a sudden the proletariat were fewer, right? So they were able to negotiate better. And this is how we got rid of a lot of issues around indentured servitude and the horrible situations that were happening in the medieval era, right? This preceded the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and all these sorts of things, right? This all came from this. But my point is that this was a period of decline when all of a sudden we weren't replacing ourselves with new babies at a replacement rate of 2.5 per 2 and all these sorts of things, which is directly tethered. Sorry, I probably sound a bit like a mad scientist here. Directly tethered to GDP growth, right? GDP growth, right? If you control that by population growth and just look at GDP per head, a lot of places are in a pretty rough spot. That's not increasing, right? And that comes back to your point around productivity, right? Are we actually getting more productive? Are we getting more affluent, right? Why is this relevant to whether you can cannibalize a built environment or not? What we're going to have to start facing in many markets around the world is not just being able to ride the wave anymore, where there's perpetual demand for housing, perpetual demand for workspace, and all those sorts of things. And so, yes, those physical spaces, those buildings aren't just going to be filled as straightforwardly as they may have. We're seeing this in Italy already. The things like pay €1 for a house as long as you come to the country and add X to the village's economy and things like that, right? So yeah, like we're at a state now where cannibalization really can happen in the built environment if these spaces aren't the spaces that the population wants to be in, for whatever reason, whether the local population is deteriorating and the replacement is happening too slowly. That's where I think cannibalization is going to potentially start coming into place. And so right now, all three of us, I can tell every room that the three of us are in is in our homes. James, you already said that you're in your home. Amy, the decor is too homely not to be home. And if you look really closely, there's a guest bed over my shoulder, right? Which our PyLabs does not provide in the workplace, sadly. And so commercial real estate is being cannibalized right now by cloud computing and teleconferencing, right? Is a real estate group going to produce the new Zoom or the new iCloud? Highly unlikely. But what are those upcoming transformations? This is the past. We already know that commercial real estate is disrupted. We've heard of the retail apocalypse and James's continuous deliveries of Amazon packages throughout the day, right? And the high street. We know these things, but what about where are the coming disruptions coming in the built environment where a lack of cannibalization is going to end up with your portfolio wiped out or going through a similar thing that commercial portfolios have just gone through?
So this feels like a gloomy prediction. What needs to change? So if there were, say, three things that you would love to see real estate leaders do kind of systematically as a means of improving innovation in this space, what would those be? What do you think needs to change?
There's something I call anti-hoc adaptability or adaptability by design, right? So something we're talking about a lot right now is adaptive reuse. And this comes back to the retrofit conversation that we're having.
Yeah.
And, James, you're talking about, again, going back to the New York City example, commercial retrofit to resi, obvious challenges there with the floor plates. What do you do around the core? Is that, a vertical farm or a data center, whatever, all those sorts of things. That's post hoc. You've built something and you're looking back and going, oh, we built this specifically for this purpose. That purpose has changed. Now we're going to have to try and do what we can to salvage the space without knocking it down, right? I propose, and this is obviously easier said than done, but I've heard rumors that there are people out there doing this, and I'm trying to get in touch with them as we speak. Essentially, not right now, but you get my point. Around this anti-hoc adaptability from day one. Can we create a financially feasible model for real estate that is adaptable by its very nature. It's not, low ceiling heights to adapt to certain use cases that don't apply to others. It's not floor plates that are only adaptable to some use cases and not others. Not just that, but it's not real estate built for people who have to be there. It's real estate built for people who want to be there, right? Because choice now, locational choice, is a thing that wasn't a thing 100 years ago. If we were having this conversation 20 years ago and we were talking about, or maybe 30 years ago, and we were talking about office space for user experience, you'd be laughed out of the room, right? People have to be there. Why does it matter, right? I don't want to talk poorly about one of the flexible operators WeWork, but I went into their offices a few times in Sydney, and I was like, God, this is an uninspired space. It was horrible to even be in, but you can probably guess who it was. But that conversation has changed so much now. This anti-hoc adaptability is, I think, is the solution to that. Adaptable spaces for changing consumer preferences.
All interesting, isn't it? Okay. I think, unless, Amy, you want to finish on like Utopia, we're probably done and used up a lot of your time, Luke. But I think
that was great. Thank you.
The challenge I've got here is that we could probably talk forever about this sort of stuff, because I think, Luke, you and I are definitely, in terms of the real estate people, probably one of very, very few that genuinely are looking at where we are now, but also have the ability to have that ambidexterity to it, where you're looking at 50 years hence, which I just don't think the market looks at. I don't think the leaders look at. I think arguably probably your home within the VC world needs to look at, because you are backing those sorts of things. But again, probably like a 10-year hence, because that's how funds generally last for you, looking for exit in that sense. But there's very few that have that ability to look in both areas, and I think that's why we could probably talk for an awful long time. Certainly on behalf of Amy and I, thanks ever so much for your time, and I'm going to end the stream. Don't disappear, because obviously Amy and I was outside of this, but just publicly for the two of us, thanks ever so much for all you